driven by optimism. That's how my guest this week describes himself, despite a childhood marked by abuse, spent in care homes and on the streets.
I think it was very clear that we were in a bad spot, that I had been dealt a bad hand, but I was somehow optimistic that things would be better.
Benjamin Perks is the head of campaigns and advocacy at the United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF, where he works to end violence against children globally. From the United Nations, I'm Melissa Fleming. This is Awake at Night. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Ben, you've worked to protect children for many years, and this work is very personal for you. It has a lot of personal significance. Your own childhood in the UK was difficult. Can you tell me what happened to you?
Yeah, I spent a large part of my life in the care system. It was quite violent, quite scary, and obviously without the protection of a parent. So, a risk of things like gang recruitment and exploitation, and also I was thrown out of school. I got into trouble, and just what you would generally call a train wreck of a childhood. Quite frankly, yeah.
You said you were in a care system, but you started out living with a family. What was that family life like?
I can't remember an enormous amount of it. Often what happens with kids affected by trauma is that we block it. So I didn't really feel like I knew my family very well, although I spent the first half of my childhood with them. I have some memories that come to the surface sometimes. But I recently found a relative a few years ago and asked about my family. And she shared this story about the way that there was a lot of violence, addiction within the family, much broader. And I kind of came to the conclusion that my situation was just the outcome of a lot of intergenerational violence and trauma. And that's why I ended up where I did.
How old were you?
10. Yeah.
And were you alone, or did you have
alone?
Oh,
Yes.
you're an only child.
Yes.
Can you remember that first day moving into that care
Yeah,
system?
I was in two children's homes. The first one was for younger kids, and it was I vaguely remember it. It was a children's home with about 20 children in, 5 to a room, 2 care staff on any given shift. You didn't particularly have a strong bond with any individual, one of them, and I think they probably tried to meet the basic needs of the child to make sure you were fed and you were clothed and clean. And then when I was a little bit older, I was transferred to a boys' home for teenagers. And that was quite violent and scary. And I remember that quite well. And I've been, through quite a bit of counselling over the years, and more memories have come back. So I kind of have more of a picture for that. And it was a place where, when you would close your eyes to sleep at night, you would be frightened of being punched in the face. Some of the staff also were violent. They practiced violence and violent discipline. This was the 1980s, so it was a different world then.
In London?
I grew up in London and Birmingham, so in both places, yeah. It was a situation where you felt completely unsafe and completely unloved. And that's just the way it was. It was about meeting the basic needs. You would have moments of kindness. And then eventually I had a teacher that showed an interest in me. And that made all the difference in my life, because it turned my really toxic stress into tolerable stress. And I was able to imagine a pathway to something away from the violence that I was surrounded by.
Yeah, I want to talk about your teacher in a bit, but I imagine that during that time you were also going to school. So you were living in the care facility, and during the day you would go to a school?
Yes, I was, but I was not doing well at school, and I got kicked out of a couple of schools. So when you're in that situation, firstly it's very hard to learn because you're in a situation of constant fear, and then also you're getting into bad behavior, gangs and all of that. So I started off at a grammar school, which was for poor but bright kids, or working class but bright kids. I lasted about a year there. I went to another school. I lasted about a year and a half, a third school. And finally, I ended up in a school that was the end of the line, that was only for kids that were living in children's homes, kids that were primarily likely to go into, a lifetime of gangs and all of that kind of stuff.
Hmm. I understand during that time you also lived on the streets?
Yes, the children's home was so violent that I would run away from there, and I would sleep on the streets for a few days at a time, sometimes a week, some months. It felt safer to be living in a squat or on a park bench than to be in a children's home at times. This is one of the major drivers of homelessness at the time in the UK, that kids would run away from violent children's homes.
Did you think at the time that this was how every child lived, or did you realize that you were in a particularly difficult spot?
Yeah, I think it was very clear that we were in a bad spot, that I was in a bad situation, that I had been dealt a bad hand, but I was somehow optimistic that things would be better.
So you always thought that somehow there was a rainbow at the end of this?
Yeah, one of my favourite stories that I remember about this time was that every morning in the children's home, I would go to the letterbox. I expected a letter to come from my parents or somebody else saying, "This has all been a terrible mistake. We're coming to collect you." Of course, it never came, but I still went and checked every day. And I explained this recently to my wife, Anna, and she thought it was very sad, but I thought actually it was a symbol of the optimism that I still held through all of that struggle.
Something innate in you.
I don't know. We never know where it comes from, but I know that I was optimistic. I knew that things would be okay in the end.
Did you ever hear anything from your parents during that time?
Bits and pieces occasionally, but nothing consistent.
You did end up at that kind of last resort, last chance school. And I believe you were struggling then until you had one particular encounter with a teacher. Can you describe that?
Yeah, her name is Jan Rapport. We're in touch to this day. And she just really was the first adult that had a conversation with me where she listened to me and I listened to her. And I think she saw something in me. And I think it may be even the beginnings of the idealism that drives a UN career, potentially. And so she gave me a book to read. And then she just started having conversations with me. And this, for most kids, might be quite normal. But for me, it was a revolution. I didn't come from a situation where kids had conversations, where you were listened to by an adult.
You were never listened to?
I think not by my parents, not in a children's home. No.
How did that feel for you when she listened to you and took you seriously and offered you books?
I think that, I didn't know at the time. I probably felt very happy at the time, but what it did was it made me feel like I mattered as an individual, which I never felt in my entire life before. And that was a game changer for me.
Did you ever get the chance to tell her that?
Yes. So many years later, as an adult, I came across an educationalist at Harvard explaining that often when kids are in deep trouble, it's teachers that help to get them back on track. And if we could bottle that skill and make it practiced by every child, we could have by every teacher, we'd have a huge impact in the world. So I walked out of that lecture and began searching for my teacher, and I found her and I went and met her and told her that.
How did she react?
I think it was quite emotional. It was she. I don't think she hears back very often from children from that situation. And also, I mean, I went to her and I said, "This is what I've done with my life." By that time, I was a representative in UNICEF and acting resident coordinator of the UN. It was like quite a prestigious role, and I was able to tell her that I wouldn't be there doing that without her. That she had transformed my life. And I still see her now to this day. We took our son to go and meet her in the summertime. Yeah.
How did you, I'm just wondering, right, after that, you started reading books and then you managed to graduate from high school. And what happened after that?
I didn't graduate from high school. I started reading a lot, and that also changed my life because I found myself in literature. I think it's James Baldwin that says that you think that you're the only person living through this pain, and then you read Dostoevsky or somebody else, and it helps you recognize that, so many people are living through trauma and through pain. So that was revolutionary in my life, and then I became a full-time campaigner at 16 at the National Association of Young People in Care in London. And we were the group that led to the reform of the law. As young people, young adults, we went to the House of Parliament and we convinced the government to change the law on children in care. So for example, one of the things we changed was you wouldn't have your own clothes. The clothes would just go into the laundry, and whatever came out, you'd be given it. Yeah. So things like the protection of children to have their own identity, their own clothes, their own, to have access to their files, to have a social worker that would protect their best interests, all things that were aligned with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which also came into force around the same time. And obviously that was something that changed my life because I became a campaigner.
That must have been very gratifying. How long did it take to make that, to implement that change?
Well, the law, we were working there in the mid-'80s or late 86, and the law came into being in 1989. It was the 1989 Child Care Act. The CRC came in, I think, the year after. Yeah, it was. I was a teenager and I was going to the House of Lords and talking about this stuff, and I couldn't quite believe it. Yeah.
And then in the evening, you'd go back to the care home and sleep.
No, I lived independently at 16. Yeah, I left the children's home at 16 and I was an adult at 16. I'd actually started working a couple of years earlier, doing, odd jobs and stuff, especially when I'd run away from the children's home. But at 16, I was living and paying my own rent, cooking my own meals and doing this job.
Wow. And then what happened?
So I worked for a couple of years for this organization, and I did some bits and pieces, and I began a relationship, and my girlfriend was at university, and she kind of said it'd be a very good idea if you went to university. So I didn't have high school qualifications, but because of the work I'd been doing with the National Association of Young People in Care, the university agreed to interview me and they gave me a place on a course. So I did, that's what I did.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
What did you feel like, how did you feel as a student there with your background as compared to the other students?
Yeah, there's a lot of stigma and shame about being from my background. I felt stigmatized by it, but I didn't want to hide it. I had gang tattoos on my arms, and these homemade tattoos, that are very common in children's homes at the time. And I just did my best to get through. I had to work quite hard outside of the study hours. When other students were partying, I had to work because I didn't have the support of a family. But I did find myself at home there as well. I loved the fact that you would debate ideas and read literature, things that I hadn't had the chance to do as a kid. I was now able to do, all day. And I enjoyed that, I think.
When did you realize that you probably went through some severe trauma and that you needed to get into counseling?
Well, that's a lot later. That's in early middle age because I was working as a UNICEF representative in Montenegro.
Okay, well, first of all, then maybe how did you get to be working at UNICEF?
That's a very funny story, actually. Okay, that's that. Then we'll go back to at the end of my first year at
I
university.
just assumed probably at university you realize, oh my God, I had such a
No.
traumatic, I need counseling, there was nothing like that there.
No, not at all. Not at all. It was just something you just got on and did it. People didn't talk about mental health those days the way they do now. So how did I join UNICEF? Well, it's quite a funny story. I did the first year of university and I became very passionate about, actually, I found my idealism and my beliefs aligned very much with the things that I was learning about the American Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King and Gandhi. I did a lot of writing about nonviolence and civil disobedience and Walden and all of that. And then I came across this guy called Ralph Bunche, who, is a hero, historic hero to most of us that work for the UN. He came from the civil rights movement, but then became a senior UN official at the very beginning of the UN journey, and somebody that, has got an amazing life. And at the same time, the war was breaking out in former Yugoslavia. And I wanted to go and do some voluntary work. So I signed up for a voluntary program through an association in London that sends young people to work in refugee programs, and it was based in Slovenia, which was adjacent to all the countries affected by the war. But I also wanted to do a story about UNICEF's work for a local thing at a university, and so I reached out to the UNICEF National Committee, and they said, "Well, can you just send us your CV because we'd like to announce journalist." I wasn't a journalist, I was a student, but they thought I was a journalist. They sent my CV, and so I raised money and I went to Zagreb from London on the bus. Right, I went on the bus with this backpack and very kind of young, clueless 20-year-old, and I arrived and I called the UNICEF office, and the woman said, "When can you start?" She's French. She's French. "When can you start? We are waiting for you." And I was like, in a couple of weeks. I had no idea what she was talking about. But I said I'll be able to start in a couple of weeks. And so I went to do my youth program, my refugee program. And then I went to the UNICEF office and I found out they were looking to recruit somebody to work 1 day a week just to edit English documents. I went in 7 days a week, worked around the clock, took a year off from university, ended up being sent to central Bosnia to run a very small field operation, distributing items, and then went back to university the following year. And to this day, I have no idea if that woman thought I was someone else. I have no idea, but I ended up going back the following year, which was very intense time because it was the fall of Srebrenica. It was a time that where they needed a lot of support. And then I finished my bachelor's and later on my master's, and I managed to get back in full time with UNICEF on the basis of the reputation and the network that I'd managed to build during my university days. So that's how I came back in, and I've stayed in ever since.
And did you feel like you had chosen the right profession then? In a way, kind of coming full circle, that now, as somebody who wasn't protected as a child, you are now working on child protection?
Yeah, I think so. I think the reason I was drawn to that work was, one, because I was an idealistic person, but I was also very pragmatic. I wanted to achieve results. I wanted results that you could measure and see in the change in people's lives at scale. And that was what UNICEF provided.
You served in a number of countries. You mentioned in the Balkans, but you also worked in Afghanistan. When were you there, and what was that like?
That was from 2001 to like 2003, 2004, and it was the end of 23 years of war. It was a hopeful time. There was the lawyer Jirga and this democratic process in Afghanistan, and it was decided that the first peace dividend for the Afghan people would be to get their kids into school. So probably in the history of the country, never more than 10% of children have been in school. And we had this huge operation to get kids into school at scale. There was no school system. We had to bring in a lot of supplies. We had to set up help local people set up schools in used factories, under trees, in tents, in caves. We had to help to train anybody that graduated high school in a very condensed period to become a teacher. We had to deliver supplies via camel train or by donkey train. It was intensive, round-the-clock work. And then on March the 23rd, 2002, was the first day of school. And I think we had all collapsed, exhausted, trying to get everything in place, and woke up that morning to see the streets full of children on the way to the school, many of them girls for the first time. And that, I have friends who work in many other rewarding types of jobs, but that feeling, I don't think anybody ever has that. That was incredible. That was an incredible feeling.
That must have been a beautiful sight.
Yeah. Yeah. And I went to go and visit some of the schools and some, a lot of the kids would ask us questions and many years later, a young adult who had been a child in one of the schools wrote to me to tell me that she started studying medicine. I don't know how many lives were changed through that, but that was an incredible experience.
I mean, you said that many of those children that UNICEF and you and your team managed to get in school were girls.
Yes.
And I believe that it was even challenging at that time. We know what has happened now, but the culture was not necessarily encouraging of bringing girls to school. What was that like? How did you deal with that and overcome that kind of barrier?
I think that what was really important was to understand where people come from. It's often you will speak about an issue that can get pushback from traditionalists. You have to find ways to communicate. So one of the big things that we did with speaking to religious leaders was explaining that if girls don't learn to read and write, they're not, as young adults, going to be able to access information on safe delivery and safe maternal and child health. And that's going to have an impact on their health. There is a risk for the family. Bringing an understanding. Obviously, we as UN people believe that every girl has a right to learn, has an equal right to learn to a boy. But if you committed to the outcome, which is to make sure that happens, you have to be able to meet people where they are and have that conversation on their own terms. I've learned that again and again and again in advocacy and communications with traditionalists and religious leaders. And in a polarized world, it's so important that we engage all constituencies.
Just fast forwarding for a moment to this time, it must be especially painful for you to see how girls are stripped of that possibility.
Yes, I think it is catastrophic for this generation, but I also believe that what happened then holds. You can't take away what people learn. So there are a generation of young women and girls in Afghanistan that already have the knowledge and the learning they otherwise wouldn't have, and that's a great asset for the future of the country.
Did any of these experiences, I mean, in Afghanistan or anywhere else where you were working, bring back memories of your own childhood?
I think that I had a huge sense of purpose in this work, and that helped maybe to distract a little bit from the things that I hadn't really fully resolved in myself.
And that sense of purpose maybe came, though, from those unresolved memories?
Yeah, I always had an enormous sense of urgency. I always had this driving sense of urgency. I always was really focused on the outcome. And I think that comes from my own childhood. You can never fully know where these things come from, but I think it comes from my own childhood.
How would you define childhood adversity?
So we use there's now a scientific sorry, it's a boring word, methodology, in which you take 10 forms of distress that occur within the home, and we measure how many of those adverse child experiences somebody's had, and we can then see the link between them and the negative life outcomes. They're into 3 groups. The first one is physical, sexual, emotional violence. The second one is emotional and physical neglect. And the third is a group of things like family dysfunction, addiction, violence between parents, undiagnosed mental health. And the more of those a child experiences, the more likely they are to have poor mental health, be addicted, be affected by crime as a victim or perpetrator, to have negative health outcomes. Almost every single well-being indicator is much worse.
You didn't mention war in that
No.
formula. I know that UNICEF is deeply, deeply concerned and also very active in theaters of war, like in Gaza or in Sudan, in Ukraine. What do you think of when you think of those children? What are they going through?
Well, it's catastrophic. It's unbearable pain. It is something that may have a lasting effect on their lives, and it's made all the worse by the fact that we seem to be backsliding on humanitarian law, respect for humanitarian law and humanitarian protection. The reason adverse child experiences is different to that is because it is the buffer of the family that protects something horrible that happens from becoming a lasting trauma. So one of the things that's really important in conflict zones is to ensure that parents are able to protect, and schools and other institutions are able to protect and support their children in the context of armed violence and conflicts.
I'm just wondering, when you're thinking about childhood trauma in the field of conflict, war, but also in other areas, what is keeping you awake at night?
I think that we are the first generation that can end child trauma overall. We're the first generation that can end toxic stress that drives child trauma. The UN, one of the proudest achievements of the UN in the 1980s was child survival revolution. Many people forget, but in 1982, only 20% of the world's children were vaccinated against the major 5 childhood diseases. There was and there was a belief at last that we could vaccinate all children in the world. And so there was a huge debate between UNICEF and WHO at the time about whether we should have a really strong focus on vaccines and 1 or 2 other interventions, or if we needed to keep pushing on a whole range of different things in the health system. In the end, it was agreed to have this very sharp focus to make sure that every child in the world could access a vaccine. Every parent had knowledge about breastfeeding. All children had their growth monitored, and rehydration salts from diarrhea to protect from diarrheal diseases were universally available. That reduced child mortality by 61%. Vaccine coverage increased from 20% of the world's children to 80% of the world's children within a decade. We can do this. Today, and at the first ever international conference on violence, we, in the outcome document, agreed that we needed to have 3 interventions to end violence against children. The first one was to universal support for parents, parenting programs, where parents learn the skills to build a strong attachment with their child. Secondly, schools that protect children, but also made children feel safe, soothed, and seen, as I was by my teacher. And thirdly, to have adequate response services. So when a child falls through the cracks of a family and a school, the system is ready to pick them up, protect them, and get them back onto a pathway to recovery. And if we could make those 3 things universally available, we believe that we can eradicate child trauma.
It's interesting that you said this is what keeps you awake at night. Actually, what has been done amazingly and what can be done.
This is the same guy that was the kid that went to the letterbox every morning. I'm driven by optimism despite having come from adversity. So
Safe, seen, and soothed.
so the idea is safe is no harm. Seen is that you matter as an individual because people are invested in you. They know you. They know your name. They know, yeah, you're known. And the third thing is soothed when you need to be. And this is because trauma is intergenerational. It's passed intergenerationally.
I've heard of that before, like from Holocaust survivors. And
Yes. You know, I've done a chapter in my book about Holocaust survivors and the descendants of slaves and Native American Indians, and all the science shows in psychology that, you know, the research in psychology has shown that it's passed, but now we have genetics. Here in New York, some of the best research with Holocaust survivors shows the way that our epigenetic makeup is affected by intergenerationally by trauma. So what we're trying to do is treat trauma like a endemic, because it's always been around. It's not a new epidemic, it's an endemic thing, but that you can break the transition through these three interventions that I mentioned.
mm, you can break that intergenerational passing on
Yes.
if you have those three interventions.
Yeah, let me give you a personal example. It's not just those three interventions. So I grew up in a children's home. I was deeply traumatized. I didn't really address it until much later, but when I did, I felt completely different about life. I was able to have much better quality of relationships. I then had a son, and when I held my son in my arms, I knew that what had happened to me was now unimaginable to myself, and that I would walk the ends of the earth to make him feel safe and loved. And I knew that that intergenerational cycle had been broken. So that made me ask the question, if I can heal from it, if I can recover and not transmit it to my child, can we do this for the whole of humanity? Can this be something that we treat as a public health campaign? And when I speak to the world's leading scientists on this, when I speak to my colleagues at WHO or within UNICEF, we all agree that it's possible.
How did you heal? Was therapy important for you?
Yes, I was a UNICEF representative. I just become a UNICEF representative. I've been working in different types of places on conflict, on health systems, on a whole range of other issues. And I found myself at a conference in Montenegro where I was a UNICEF representative. And it was about deinstitutionalization. And there was a guy speaking about how kids that grow up in institutional care, they often end up in situations where they can't form healthy relationships. They keep things bottled up inside of them. They often keep a distance from other people. They have a struggle with intimacy and all of that. And I sat there and I realized that he was talking about me. And I was a dignitary there. I was there with the minister. I was wearing a suit. All these cameras were on us. We were on the same platform as him. And I felt myself go almost bright red, right? I was shrinking into my suit because I just felt he was telling my story. And so I walked out of there at the break, excused myself from the minister, and I immediately called a friend who I knew had been seeing a counsellor. And I asked for the number, and I called and booked an appointment before I could change my mind. And I kept to it, and I went to see the counsellor. And it was the start of a journey that lasted a year. I went every week. I had this psychotherapy, and then I started doing other things like mindfulness. I started being kinder to myself. I put a lot of pressure on myself, and the world just went from black and white to color. All of this was buttoned up inside of me. It wasn't something that was necessarily visible to the outside world, but I realized that I was missing so much from life, keeping all this stuff within. And that was it. That was my story. And so that at the end of that process, that's when I asked myself, if I can heal from this, can we not prevent it in the first place for every child?
And I understand you're married and you mentioned your little son. How did you meet your wife?
We met in Macedonia. I was working there, and yeah, she's yeah,
So it was during that time that you were healing,
yeah. Sometime afterwards, yeah, yeah, yeah,
and that opened yourself up to being able to
yeah.
have a relationship.
Yeah, I think I was kind of in like the James Bond type attachment style where you just like where you're bulletproof. Nobody can you're social, but you can't really get close to anybody. And I think that after the healing, I went through a real transformation in my own life, and yeah, I felt like I was ready for a relationship. And when you're ready, I think it changes.
Mm. What's your son's name?
Noah,
Noah.
yeah, yeah,
And how old is he now?
2.5.
Wonderful. If you had a chance to go back to the young Ben Perks, what would you say to him?
Um, I'd say right. Well, this is quite personal. I'd say that it's the way I think it was Bill Clinton said it's the economy stupid. I would say it's relationships stupid, right? Like, so healing comes from relationships normally. I mean, people can have therapy, but it's the relationships that are the buffer against trauma. And I'd probably tell him not to go on a UN career where you go around the world, because, in that situation, it would have made more sense for me to have stayed in one place, don't get me wrong, it's the best. UN is the best organization to work for in the world, especially my agency, UNICEF. I'm very happy I did. But I think for people, giving advice to people now, young people from care backgrounds, it's try and stay within your community, form bonds, you heal through relationships. Because I think that what I did as a young guy was say to myself, if I get through university, if I get a proper career, if I do okay, it will solve everything. But it doesn't. Because the only thing that really solves anything is love, is connection, is relationships. Yeah.
Is there anything that we can all do? I mean, you mentioned the roles of care homes, of teachers, of parents. How can we? It probably takes a village. It takes the whole
Yeah.
world to heal childhood trauma.
I think the first thing to do is to recognize that more than half of us have grown up with some form of adverse childhood experience. All the data sets show that around 57% of the population have had one adverse childhood experience. Kids from care are the very visible iceberg tip of a largely submerged iceberg. So everybody around you, 1 in 2 of them have been affected by some form of adversity, and about 1 in 5 have been affected by severe adversity. We know that many more people than we previously thought were affected by child sexual abuse. We know that these things are the major driver of obesity, addiction, inability to form relationships. All of these things are largely driven by the fact that our development as children is distorted. So there's no such thing as a trauma-neutral workplace, school, or organization. So we have to show compassion to the people that we're faced with, even when they're objectionable, because we never know where they come from. We never know what they're dealing with.
Compassion, I guess, is the final word. Thanks so much, Ben, for telling us your story and about the amazing work that you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Awake at Night. We'll be back soon with more incredible and inspiring stories from people working against huge challenges to make this world a better and safer place. To find out more about the series and the extraordinary people featured, do visit un.org/awake-at-night. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please take the time to review us. It helps more people to find the show. Thanks to my editor, Bethany Bell, to Adam Paler, Josie LeBlond, and my colleagues at the UN, Caterina Catidi, Roberta Politi, Geneva Damianti, Tulin Batiki, Becerra Kostova, Angelica Devis, and Carlos Macias. The original music for this podcast was written and performed by Nadine Shaw and produced by Ben Hillier. Additional music was by Pascal Wise.